Every night, without fail, the old dog would sneak into the hospital. Its movements were quiet, careful, almost as if it was trying not to be noticed. But the security cameras didn't miss a thing. Each evening, as the world outside grew still and quiet, the dog would approach the entrance with a determined look in its eyes, tail low, and paws soft against the cold floor. At first, no one really paid attention to the footage. It was just a dog. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? But as the nights passed, the behavior became more frequent, and the hospital staff couldn't help but wonder, why was this dog coming back again and again? And why did it seem to have such a sense of urgency, as if it were searching for something or someone? For days, the hospital security team watched the footage with growing curiosity. The dog wasn't being aggressive, wasn't causing any trouble. It simply walked through the halls, its eyes fixed ahead as if it knew exactly where it was going. It wasn't just wandering. There was a purpose behind its nightly visits. And that's when the heartbreaking truth started to unfold. The dog had a story of its own, one that would pull at the heartstrings of anyone who heard it. You see, it wasn't just any dog. This elderly, frail creature had spent years by the side of someone who had been at the hospital for a long time. The person it had shared so many days with, the person it had trusted completely, was no longer there. But for reasons no one could immediately understand, the dog couldn't bear to leave. Every night, it would return, desperately searching the hospital corridors. It wasn't just wandering, it was looking for the one it had loved and protected. What had happened to that person? Why was the dog so determined to find them, even though the hospital staff had no idea who they were or where they had gone? The story seemed simple at first, but as more details surfaced, the reality was far more complicated and emotionally charged than anyone could have anticipated. What the staff learned over time was nothing short of heartbreaking. The old dog's late-night visits were not a random act of confusion or loneliness. It was mourning. It was hoping. It was still waiting. Waiting for a loved one who had slipped away far too soon, someone who, despite their absence, had left a lasting mark on the dog's heart. But there was something more to this than just a dog's mourning. This wasn't just about a pet looking for its owner. It was about the kind of bond that transcends words, that doesn't need anything but the presence of another. It was about devotion, loyalty, and the profound connection that can form between a person and their animal companion. And as the hospital staff slowly pieced together this emotional puzzle, they began to realize that the story of this dog wasn't just about loss, it was also about love in its purest, most unshakable form. As the nights went on, the hospital staff became more and more involved. They couldn't simply ignore the dog anymore. They started talking about it in hushed tones, debating what they should do. Some thought the dog should be adopted, given a home where it could finally rest its weary paws. Others suggested that perhaps the dog was better off continuing its nightly routine, that it had found a purpose in these visits, even if it was heartbreaking to watch. But no one could deny that the dog's presence had sparked something within the hospital, a kind of shared empathy, a reminder of the deep connections people form with animals, and the way those connections shape our lives. One nurse, particularly moved by the dog's story, decided to investigate further. She began asking questions around the hospital, trying to uncover any details that might explain the dog's nightly visits. She reached out to other staff members who had worked at the hospital for a long time, hoping someone might know more. And then, one evening, she came across something that would change everything. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place, a small but significant detail that could explain the dog's attachment to the hospital, and to one specific room. It wasn't a coincidence that the dog kept coming back. There was a reason it was drawn to that particular part of the building, a reason it couldn't let go. But what was the truth behind this? What had really happened to the person the dog had been waiting for all this time? And what would the dog do when it finally realized the painful truth? This story isn't just about a dog's loyalty. It's about the love we have for those who have touched our lives in ways we might not fully understand. It's about the bonds that remain, even when the world changes around us. And it's about how sometimes, even the smallest acts of devotion can leave the deepest scars. As the nurse continued to investigate, she began to uncover more heartbreaking details. The connection between the dog and its owner was more profound than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a pet and its owner, it was a shared history, a shared life, filled with both joy and sorrow. And the more she learned, the more she understood why the dog had refused to give up on its nightly visits. But the truth is, even after all the pieces were in place, there was still one question that lingered in the air. Would the dog ever find peace? Would it ever stop searching the hospital halls for the person it had loved so much? Or was this devotion, this endless searching, part of the dog's journey, one that had no end? To truly understand this story, we need to dive deeper into the dog's past, into the moments that had shaped its life, into the love it had shared with someone who, in a way, had become its everything. And perhaps through this journey, we'll all come to realize that the power of love is sometimes stronger than anything we can imagine. As the nurse dug deeper into the hospital's history, she began to find fragments of a story that, while scattered, slowly began to take shape. It wasn't just the dog's nightly visits that puzzled her, it was the profound sense of attachment it seemed to have. The dog was not a stray, it had a well-kept coat, and its movements were deliberate, as if it had been trained or cared for over the years. It wasn't a random animal wandering the halls. This dog had a purpose, and that purpose seemed to lead directly to one particular patient room on the hospital's second floor. The nurse, whose name was Anna, had been working at the hospital for a few years. She knew most of the patients and their families, but this dog had never been seen before. Anna had heard rumors about an elderly patient, someone who had spent a long time in the hospital, someone whose family rarely visited, if at all. Could the dog have belonged to that patient? Anna felt a sense of unease growing inside her, the kind that comes when you start to sense a bigger story unfolding just beyond your reach. She decided to ask around. The more people she spoke to, the more she realized that the dog had been seen not just in the hallways but also outside the patient's room at odd hours. It would sit by the door, its eyes trained on the entrance, waiting. At first, no one thought much of it. People assumed it was a stray that had wandered in, or perhaps a dog that belonged to one of the staff members. But as time went on, its visits became more regular, and the staff started to wonder, was it just waiting for a glimpse of its owner? Or was there something else going on? After several days of asking around and piecing together small details, Anna discovered something that made her blood run cold. The elderly patient everyone had whispered about, the one who rarely had visitors, had passed away just a few weeks ago. The funeral had been small, almost no one attended. It was clear from the records that the patient had been alone for a long time, with no family to care for them. The only thing they had was the dog. Anna's heart sank as she realized the truth. The dog wasn't just coming to the hospital because it was confused or lonely. It was coming to the place where its owner had spent their final days. The dog wasn't just searching for any person. It was searching for that person. The bond they had shared must have been deep, strong enough to keep the dog coming back every night, hoping against hope that it would somehow find its way back to its owner. But why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? Why had the dog been allowed to wander the hospital at night without anyone questioning it more thoroughly? As Anna continued to piece together the story, she learned that the dog had been a constant companion to the elderly patient during their long stay. It had been brought in by a friend of the patient's family, someone who had promised to look after the dog while the patient was in the hospital. That friend had disappeared shortly after the patient passed away, leaving the dog to fend for itself. Anna began to feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She couldn't shake the image of the dog, standing alone in the hospital corridors, waiting by the door that would never open again. The grief and devotion that had kept the dog coming back for nights on end seemed so human, so raw. She knew she had to do something, but what? The dog needed closure, But how could she give it closure when she didn't even know the full story? Was it right to let the dog continue searching for someone who was never coming back? One night, as Anna sat alone in the break room, her mind racing with questions, she saw the footage again. The old dog was walking through the halls, just as it had done every other night. But tonight something was different. Tonight the dog wasn't wandering aimlessly. Tonight, it seemed to have found something. Or rather, someone. The camera footage showed the dog standing in front of room 203, staring at the door with an intensity that was almost pleading. Anna stared at the screen, a chill running down her spine. The dog's behavior was different this time. It didn't move away after a few minutes like it usually did. Instead, it stayed there. For hours. Its head rested against the door as if it were trying to get closer to the person it loved. Anna leaned in, trying to make sense of it. But there was no one inside the room. The room had been empty for weeks. It was the same room where the elderly patient had spent their last days, and it had been cleared out after the funeral. So why was the dog still standing there, as if waiting for someone to open the door? It was as if the dog didn't understand that its owner was gone, that the person it had shared so many years with was never going to walk through that door again. Anna's heart broke as she watched the footage. She could feel the dog's pain, its confusion, its unwavering love. The animal was so clearly searching for someone who could never return. It wasn't just a lost pet, it was a living, breathing representation of grief, of the kind of love that endures even in the face of death. Anna knew that the dog couldn't keep living like this. It couldn't keep returning to the hospital every night, hoping for a reunion that would never happen. But what could she do? She wasn't equipped to help the dog move on. She wasn't a therapist, not for animals anyway. All she could do was watch as the dog repeated the same heartbreaking ritual every night. It wasn't until a few days later, when Anna was speaking to one of the hospital's senior nurses, that she learned something unexpected. The nurse, who had worked at the hospital for decades, told Anna about a tradition the hospital had kept for years, one that very few people knew about. It was a quiet, unofficial program, one that was meant to help patients who passed away without any family find some semblance of closure. The program, as it turned out, wasn't just for the people who had passed, it was also for their animals. The tradition had started many years ago with a few compassionate staff members who had noticed that some patients' pets had nowhere to go after their owners passed. These staff members took it upon themselves to make sure the animals were cared for, even if it meant bringing them into the hospital to be with their owners during their final days. Over time, the program had grown, quietly and without fanfare. It was a way of making sure that, even in death, the bond between person and pet wasn't completely severed. Anna listened in awe as the nurse explained how the program had helped countless pets, giving them a chance to say goodbye, even if it was in their own way. But this dog, the one that had been roaming the hospital every night, wasn't part of that program. It had been left behind, forgotten by the person who had promised to care for it. And now, it was caught in a cycle of grief, coming back every night, as if hoping that the hospital doors would open and bring back the one it had loved. Anna realized that she had to do something. She couldn't let this dog continue living in this endless loop of loss. But what could she do? Could she be the one to give it closure? Could she be the one to finally end the dog's search for a person who would never come back? But there was still one more piece of the puzzle left to uncover. What was the full story of the elderly patient? Why had they been alone in their final days? What had happened to their family, the ones who had promised to care for both the patient and the dog? Anna needed to find answers to these questions, but every step she took only seemed to lead to more mystery. The more Anna uncovered, the more complicated the situation became. There were gaps in the records, things that didn't add up. Who was the person who had promised to care for the dog after the patient's death? Why had they disappeared so quickly after the funeral? And most importantly, why had the dog been left behind? Anna's determination grew stronger. She couldn't leave this story unfinished, not for the dog, not for the patient, and certainly not for herself. But as she began to dig deeper, she realized something terrifying. The answers she was seeking might be harder to find than she had ever imagined. Some mysteries, she was beginning to understand, might not have an easy solution. And as she stood in front of that empty hospital room, watching the dog one more time, she felt the weight of something much larger than she had ever anticipated, the kind of grief and love that could leave scars no one could see. The more Anna investigated, the more the mystery of the elderly patient seemed to unravel into something much darker than she had anticipated. Every time she thought she was close to a breakthrough, new questions seemed to appear, complicating matters even further. The patient's records were incomplete. The names on the forms seemed to have been altered, or at least they didn't match up with anything she could find in the system. Most unsettling of all was the sudden disappearance of the person who had promised to care for the dog after the patient's death. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding something. She had spoken to nearly everyone in the hospital, even some of the long-term employees who had worked there for years, but no one seemed to know anything concrete about the patient's background or the dog's situation. There were whispers, of course, rumors about a wealthy family that had vanished without a trace, and vague mentions of a troubled past. But none of it added up. Late one evening, after her shift had ended, Anna found herself walking through the quiet halls once again, her mind racing with everything she had learned. She passed by room 203, and as always, the dog was there. This time, though, the dog wasn't sitting at the door or resting against it as it usually did. It was pacing back and forth, clearly agitated, its paws clicking softly against the linoleum floor. Its head darted from side to side, as though it had sensed something Anna couldn't yet understand. Anna paused, staring at the dog through the glass. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Something felt wrong, almost like the air in the hospital had shifted, like it was charged with a sense of impending danger. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just dealing with a dog grieving for its owner. There was something deeper at play here, something the dog had been trying to tell her from the very beginning. Without thinking, she opened the door to the room and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The dog's ears perked up at the sound, and it immediately stopped pacing, locking eyes with her. Its expression was intense, but there was also a kind of pleading in its gaze, as though it wanted her to understand something it couldn't communicate. Anna swallowed hard, her breath shallow as she approached the dog. The room was silent, save for the sound of her breathing and the soft rustling of the dog's fur. The curtains were drawn, and the air felt cold despite the heating being on. Anna stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before she noticed something strange. On the small table beside the bed, there was a letter. It wasn't there before. The table had been cleared after the patient's death, so where had it come from? Her curiosity piqued. Anna hesitated for a moment before reaching out and gently picking it up. It was a simple, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded but still legible. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, just a vague, scribbled name that was almost unrecognizable. Her heart skipped a beat as she began to read. "I will always be there, even when you think I'm gone." The words were strange, haunting, and they sent a chill through Anna's entire body. The letter didn't feel like it was written by the patient themselves, it didn't even feel like something that would belong to a person. As she scanned it further, Anna realized the letter was written from the perspective of someone or something promising to return. But return from where? Was it possible that the letter had been written for the dog? The phrasing was so unusual, so disconnected from reality, that Anna couldn't help but wonder if she had stumbled onto something more sinister than she had imagined. Suddenly, the dog let out a low, mournful whine. Anna looked down and saw its eyes now fixed on the door. The air felt thick with tension, almost as if the dog were warning her to leave. But Anna couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth. She took another step toward the bed, her breath catching in her throat as she noticed something else. There, tucked underneath the bed, was a small, weathered box. It seemed out of place, as though it had been hidden deliberately. Anna reached for it, her hands trembling, and carefully pulled it out. It was locked, but there was something familiar about it, something that made her stomach tighten. As she tried to open the box, she realized the lock wasn't completely secure. With a gentle twist, the lid creaked open. Inside, there was a collection of old photographs, some yellowing, some still in decent condition. At first glance, they seemed to depict the elderly patient with a younger woman, standing together in front of a small house, smiling. But Anna's gaze lingered on one photo in particular. The woman in the photo didn't just look like someone close to the patient, she looked almost exactly like the dog. The resemblance was uncanny. The same eyes. The same face, softened by age. Anna felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the realization hit her. The dog had to have been the woman's, perhaps it had been her companion before she passed, before the patient took it in. But if that was true, why had the woman been so closely linked to the patient's life? Why hadn't the dog been taken with her after her death? Anna stood frozen, staring at the photograph, when she heard a noise behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing in her chest. The door had creaked open. The dog, once again, was looking toward it, its expression now one of intense focus. Anna's instincts told her to leave, but she was rooted to the spot. Something was happening. Something was about to change. The dog moved quickly toward the door, and for the first time, Anna noticed something strange. There, at the threshold of the room, was a faint shadow, barely visible, but enough to make her heart race even faster. The shadow didn't belong to anyone. She knew. It wasn't human. It seemed wrong somehow. A sudden gust of wind blew through the hallway, making the curtains flutter, but the shadow remained. It lingered at the door, watching them. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the dog let out a bark, not of fear, but of recognition. Its tail wagged furiously, as if greeting someone it had been waiting for. Anna stepped backward, her legs shaking, as the shadow inched closer. She reached for her phone to call for help, but her fingers froze. No signal. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped, sending a chill through her spine. The dog, however, didn't seem afraid. It was almost as if it had known this would happen, as if it had been waiting for the moment when the past would finally return. The door swung open completely, but to Anna's horror, no one was there. Yet she could feel that something was in the room with them. Something not quite human. The dog, calm and focused, stepped into the doorway, its eyes never leaving the empty hallway. The shadow seemed to move with it, as though the dog was leading the way. Anna stood frozen, her mind racing to make sense of everything she had just uncovered. Was the dog leading her towards some sort of resolution? Or was it showing her the truth about a past that no one wanted to remember? The mystery was far from over. Anna stood in the doorway, her heart pounding as the dog trotted into the empty hallway, its ears perked, its body moving with purpose, as though it had a destination in mind. For a moment, everything felt unnervingly still, the air thick with anticipation. Anna didn't know why, but she felt like the dog wasn't just wandering aimlessly anymore. It was like it was leading her somewhere, like it wanted her to follow. The shadow, still faint and barely perceptible in the corner of her vision, seemed to flicker and twitch as the dog moved. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. There was something undeniably off about the whole situation, as though the boundaries between reality and something far darker were blurring. The dog, now in the middle of the hallway, stopped in its tracks and turned to look back at Anna. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she noticed something strange, a flicker of recognition in its gaze, as though it understood something Anna didn't. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The dog's calmness seemed almost knowing. And then, as quickly as it had stopped, the animal started walking again, tail wagging, moving further into the corridor, down the darkened hall toward the stairwell at the end. Anna hesitated, her body frozen in place, her feet unwilling to take another step. She had been following the dog's movements for days, trying to piece together the story, but now she was so deep in the mystery she wasn't sure where it would lead. Every instinct in her told her to leave, to call for backup. This wasn't just about a dog searching for its owner anymore. Something had changed, something sinister had entered the picture. But just as she made up her mind to turn around, to walk away from this haunting situation, the lights above her flickered once again, and the temperature dropped. The hallway, once cold but manageable, now felt bone-chilling. The dog didn't seem to notice, but Anna couldn't ignore the unease that was crawling up her spine. She took a deep breath, and with shaky steps, followed the dog, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The deeper she walked into the hallway, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in around her, as though the building was alive with a dark presence that didn't want to be disturbed. Each flicker of the fluorescent lights made her heart skip, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. As she reached the stairwell, she saw the dog stand at the bottom of the stairs, its body still as it stared down into the darkened depths. It was almost as if it was waiting for her to take the next step, as though the journey wasn't complete without her following. Anna's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was still empty. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time, she wished she had never decided to uncover the truth. With a sense of trepidation, she stepped forward. As her foot hit the first step, the lights above her flickered again, this time plunging the stairwell into complete darkness for a brief, horrifying moment. Her breath hitched, and she froze, listening intently for any sounds, any movement. Nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light returned, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. But she couldn't turn back now. The dog was already descending the stairs, its tail swaying gently in the dim light. Anna followed, each step echoing off the cold walls as the dog's pace quickened. She was almost at the bottom when a door to the side of the stairwell creaked open. Anna's breath caught. Her eyes instinctively flicked to the source of the sound, but it was only a janitor's closet, no one inside. She exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself it was just the building settling, just her nerves getting the better of her. But when she looked down at the dog, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just standing there anymore. The dog was looking up at her with those intense, knowing eyes, but now its body was unnaturally still. For a brief, fleeting moment, Anna could have sworn it wasn't the same dog anymore. The familiar warmth in its eyes seemed to have vanished, replaced with something darker, something almost otherworldly. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet creaked. A deep, groaning sound echoed through the stairwell, as if something deep within the building was shifting, waking. Anna took another step forward, her body trembling, but as soon as her foot touched the ground, the entire stairwell plunged into darkness again. This time, there was no flickering light to comfort her. The silence was deafening, a vacuum of sound that threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't even hear the dog anymore. Panic surged in her chest, and Anna quickly pulled her phone from her pocket, praying for a signal. She found nothing but static. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the screen, but it was no use, she was completely cut off. Then, from the depths of the darkness, came a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, unmistakable footsteps. The distinct echo of something heavy walking toward her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned toward the sound, but the darkness was absolute. She couldn't see a thing. The footsteps came closer, closer, until she felt something warm brush against her leg. She gasped, stepping back, but there was nothing there. The dog, where had it gone? Had it been walking ahead of her just moments ago? And then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. Anna's breath hitched as the world around her came back into focus. She was at the bottom of the stairs now, staring at the hallway before her. But something was wrong, something was off. The air was thick, heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. The dog was nowhere to be seen. The hallway stretched out before her, long and unbroken. But at the far end of it, in the dim glow of the fluorescent lights, she could see something. A shadow. A figure. Anna's blood ran cold as the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't the dog. It wasn't human, either. It was a woman, pale, almost ghostly in appearance, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown that looked decades out of place. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, a matted mess, and her eyes were dark, empty voids. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Anna couldn't breathe. Every instinct told her to run, to turn and flee, but her body refused to obey. She stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, as the woman the thing took a step toward her. Then another. And another. Anna's heart raced as she realized what was happening. This was the moment everything had been leading to. This was what the dog had been guiding her toward. But what was she supposed to do? How could she escape this nightmare? The figure stopped just a few feet away, and in the flickering light, it reached out its hand. It wasn't the hand of a human, it was cold, unnatural. The room seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing down, as though the shadows themselves were coming alive. The dog appeared behind the figure, its eyes now completely black, its face twisted in a grotesque snarl. It wasn't the dog she had followed. This was something else. Something far darker. Anna stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. And then, as quickly as the darkness had come, the figure vanished. The hallway was empty once again, leaving Anna standing alone in the dim light, her mind reeling from what she had just seen. But something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That something was still there, just out of sight, waiting. The dog, the figure, the shadows, they were all part of a much larger mystery, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. And deep inside, Anna felt an eerie certainty: this was only the beginning. Anna's heart thundered in her chest as she stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, still reeling from the horrifying encounter with the shadowy figure and the dog now transformed into something unrecognizable. Her pulse echoed in her ears, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to leave, to run as far and as fast as she could. But something held her there, something deeper than fear and need to understand, to unravel the truth that had been buried for so long. The silence around her was suffocating, and yet she felt the weight of something pressing in on her, as if the very walls of the hospital were closing in. The dog, now gone, had been the key to everything, guiding her down this terrifying path. But what had it been trying to show her? And what was that figure, the woman in the hospital gown? Anna's thoughts raced. She remembered the old photographs she had found in the box, the ones of the elderly patient with the woman who looked just like the dog. What if the patient hadn't been alone after all? What if the woman, the one the dog had been searching for, had died long ago but was somehow still tied to this place? Had the woman's spirit never left? Was she still wandering the halls, trying to find the dog? Trying to find something else? Anna's breath caught as a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if the woman's death hadn't been an accident? What if something had happened, something dark and twisted that had bound her spirit to the hospital? Was that what the dog had been trying to show her? Had the animal somehow sensed the truth all along? The more Anna considered it, the clearer it became. The hospital was a place full of secrets, some buried under layers of paperwork, others hidden in the shadows. The dog had been searching for answers, trying to find closure for its owner. But now, with the dog gone and the mystery all but solved, there was one final piece to uncover. Without thinking, Anna turned and walked toward the stairs once more. The stairwell, dark and silent, seemed to stretch out before her, waiting for her to descend into whatever lay below. Her heart was in her throat as she took a step, and then another, heading toward the very place where the mysterious woman had appeared. The deeper she descended, the more the temperature dropped. A heavy weight seemed to press down on her chest as the hallway stretched out in front of her, darker now, more oppressive. The flickering lights only added to the sense of dread creeping up her spine. And then she saw at the end of the hallway, where the light barely reached, a door stood ajar. The familiar sense of something being wrong flooded her. She'd passed that door dozens of times before, never thinking anything of it. But now, something inside told her that this was where it all began, and where it would all end. This was the room the dog had been leading her to. Her pulse quickened as she approached, each step seeming to make the silence around her even more suffocating. The door creaked open as she pushed it, revealing a room she had never seen before, hidden behind the scenes of the hospital's main areas, as though intentionally forgotten. The room was small, with cracked walls and old medical equipment that hadn't been used in years. But it wasn't the room itself that made Anna's stomach twist in fear, it was the large, rusted metal cabinet in the corner. It was out of place, standing so starkly in the middle of the otherwise decaying space. Something about it seemed important. She walked toward it, drawn inexplicably to it, though every part of her wanted to turn and run. Her hands shook as she reached for the cabinet, pulling open the creaky door. Inside, stacked on top of one another, were old records, patient files. Anna's fingers skimmed the top of the pile, pulling out one file at random. The name on the front froze her blood. It was the elderly patient's name, the one who had died not long ago. But there was more. Beneath it was another name, the woman, the one from the photographs. The woman who had looked so much like the dog. But that wasn't all. Anna flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the documents, each one confirming what she had only dared to suspect: the elderly patient had not been the one in charge of the dog. The woman, whose death had been recorded decades ago, had been the one who had brought the animal into the hospital. The dog had not been hers, it had belonged to her. The next page made Anna's heart stop. The woman hadn't just died from natural causes. The cause of death was listed as a violent incident. The woman had been murdered. But the strangest part wasn't just the violent nature of the death, it was the date. The woman's murder had occurred on the same night the elderly patient had entered the hospital for the first time. The exact same night. The record suggested that the patient had arrived shortly after the woman's death, almost as if someone had brought her in under the guise of needing medical care. But the truth, buried deep within the forgotten corners of the hospital, painted a far darker picture. The woman's death hadn't been an accident. She had been silenced for reasons no one dared to question. And somehow, her spirit had remained bound to this place, wandering the hallways in search of closure or perhaps revenge. Anna felt her stomach lurch as she connected the final dots. The dog hadn't been waiting for its owner after all. It had been waiting for the spirit of the woman, the one who had been murdered all those years ago. The dog had been searching for justice, a way to free her from the hospital's twisted grip. Just then, she heard the low growl of the dog. It was faint, but unmistakable. Anna turned toward the door of the room, her breath catching in her throat. The shadowy figure appeared again, the woman, her eyes now full of longing, her mouth moving in silent pleas. The dog stood beside her, its eyes gleaming, as if urging Anna to understand. Anna's body trembled, and as she backed away slowly, the door slammed shut behind her, locking her in the darkened room with the ghostly figure. For a brief moment, time stood still. And then, everything changed. The woman's form flickered, her features distorting in the dim light. She wasn't just a spirit, she was something more. Something tied to this hospital by dark forces that had twisted her existence. Her eyes met Anna's, and in that instant, Anna understood. The woman hadn't been murdered simply for revenge. She had been killed for a far more sinister reason. Her death had been orchestrated by those in the hospital who wanted to keep the secrets of their twisted practices hidden. And the dog? The dog had been the only witness, the only one who could expose what had really happened. In the final moments, as Anna tried to piece together the mystery of the woman's death, the ghostly figure of the woman stepped closer, her hand outstretched. And then, with a gasp, Anna realized the dog had been protecting her all along. The animal hadn't just been guiding her toward the truth. It had been leading her to her own salvation. As the figure reached out, Anna felt a rush of cold air, and then, without warning, everything went dark. When she awoke, she was back in the hospital lobby, as though nothing had ever happened. The dog was nowhere to be seen. But as Anna sat up, disoriented, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The woman's name, the one from the records, had been erased from the hospital's files. Everything about her had disappeared, wiped clean from history. And in the back of Anna's mind, the unsettling truth lingered: some secrets, some souls, are never truly gone. Anna blinked as she sat up, her head throbbing. Her eyes struggled to focus, the fluorescent lights overhead too bright against her still blurry vision. She was back in the hospital lobby, sitting on one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs near the front desk. The place looked exactly the same: quiet, sterile, and unnervingly calm. There was no sign of the darkness she had just felt, no trace of the haunting woman or the dog that had led her through the hospital's twisted halls. Her fingers trembled as she touched her face, as though confirming she was still real, still here. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The last thing she remembered was the chilling encounter in the hidden room. Then everything went black. It didn't make sense. How had she ended up back here, in the lobby, as though nothing had happened at all? Anna stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the receptionist's desk. A nurse sat behind the counter, typing something into a computer, completely unaware of the confusion running through Anna's mind. "Excuse me," Anna said, her voice shaky. The nurse looked up at her, and Anna could tell from the blank expression that nothing was unusual about her. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked in a polite, robotic tone. Anna opened her mouth to respond, but she couldn't find the words. It was as if the questions she had were locked away in her mind, unable to escape. The woman in the hospital gown, the dog, the hidden room, all of it felt like a distant dream. It was as though the hospital itself was pressing down on her thoughts, blurring the lines between what had happened and what was real. She swallowed hard and forced herself to take a deep breath. The woman, the one who used to be a patient here. And the dog, the nurse's face remained expressionless. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. No one by that name ever stayed here. And there are no dogs allowed in the hospital." She smiled, the same practiced, empty smile that Anna had seen countless times before. Anna's stomach churned. She couldn't understand it. She had seen it all. The hospital had been full of darkness, of secrets. She had felt the presence of something deeply wrong, something that wasn't just a figment of her imagination. But now, it seemed as though the hospital had erased it all, as if nothing had happened. "Is there anyone else I can talk to?" Anna asked, her voice tight. The nurse gave a brief nod, still smiling. "I'll let the supervisor know. Please have a seat." Anna nodded numbly and sat back down. The room around her felt colder now, emptier. She looked around, but everything seemed ordinary. The receptionist was back to typing, the sterile walls were the same, and the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the background, nothing out of place. The hospital had returned to its usual rhythm, as if the nightmare she had lived through had never occurred. But deep down, Anna knew it hadn't been a dream. She could still feel it, the eerie sense of something lurking just beneath the surface of this place, waiting to be uncovered. The dog had led her through the darkness, revealing the hidden truths of the hospital's past. It had shown her the woman, the one who had died under mysterious circumstances, the one whose spirit had never left. Anna had felt the weight of that woman's presence, the unresolved grief, the haunting sorrow. And now it was gone. The supervisor came out shortly after, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression. Anna stood up immediately, wanting answers. He gave her a polite nod and gestured for her to follow him to his office. They walked in silence down the hall, the oppressive atmosphere from before still lingering in the air, though the hospital seemed much brighter now, almost too bright. As they reached his office, the supervisor motioned for her to sit. Anna did so, still trying to make sense of everything. He closed the door behind him and sat down, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "I understand you have some questions," he said, his tone businesslike but calm. He wasn't angry, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Anna hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. "I don't understand." "The patient, the woman. She was killed, right?" "I found the records, but now they're gone. I saw her spirit. I saw the dog. It was leading me through the hospital." "What's going on here?" The supervisor didn't react immediately. He simply sat there, staring at her. For a moment, the room felt suffocatingly quiet, and Anna thought she might lose her mind if she didn't get some answers soon. Finally, the supervisor leaned forward. "I'm sorry, but there seems to have been some confusion. There's no record of the woman you're talking about. And as I mentioned before, we don't allow animals here, especially not dogs." Anna's chest tightened. "But I saw her. I felt her. And the dog, it was real. It was searching for her." He sighed deeply, a faint look of regret crossing his face. "I'm afraid the things you've experienced are not part of what we consider normal operations. Hospitals, especially older ones like this, have a long history. There are many things that people choose to forget, and sometimes, people see things. Hear things that others don't." His words hung in the air like a warning, but Anna wasn't sure what he was trying to say. She stared at him, trying to read his expression, but there was no telling whether he was hiding something or simply unwilling to confront the truth. "The truth about what happened here," Anna said slowly, "about the woman and the dog. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" "You must. It's all connected. The way the records were wiped, the way the hospital tried to erase her from history." The supervisor didn't flinch. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. "Some things are better left buried, miss. Some things are better forgotten. People come and go from this hospital. Lives are lost, and some of them leave behind unfinished business. But the hospital moves on. It has to." Anna's breath caught in her throat. "So, you're saying you know about it? You know what happened to her? To the woman?" He turned to face her then, his eyes cold and unreadable. "I know that people are always looking for answers, especially in places like this. But not all questions should be asked. Some things, once uncovered, can never be undone. Do you understand what I mean?" Anna's mind spun. She couldn't just let it go. The dog had shown her the way, had led her down the path towards something dark and buried, something that the hospital had tried to hide. But now, the supervisor's words were like a stone wall, and Anna felt herself faltering, unsure of what to do next. "Is there any way to make it right?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. The supervisor's face softened, just for a moment, but it was gone before Anna could fully process it. "Sometimes things work themselves out in ways we don't expect. Sometimes the truth is buried for a reason. You have your answers. Maybe that's enough." Anna didn't know what to say. She felt the weight of his words settling over her, pushing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The truth was out there, but it was shrouded in darkness, just like the hospital itself. The dog, the woman, the spirit that had been trapped within these walls, they were all part of something larger, something Anna couldn't fully understand. But whatever it was, it had been contained here, buried in the past. The supervisor's voice broke her thoughts. "You should go home now. It's late." You've had a long day. Anna nodded slowly, the finality of his words echoing in her mind. She felt empty, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. There was no closure. No resolution. Just the haunting sense that the mystery wasn't over. Not really. As she left the supervisor's office and made her way toward the hospital exit, Anna glanced one last time at the empty hallway. The dog, the woman, and the answers she had been looking for, they were all gone now. She had faced the darkness, followed the clues, but the hospital's secrets would remain locked away. The mystery had unfolded in a way she hadn't expected, leaving her with more questions than answers. But as she stepped out into the night air and walked toward her car, a strange sense of peace washed over her. She had learned the truth, even if the hospital had done everything it could to erase it. She couldn't change the past, but at least she had seen it. At least she had tried. And maybe, just maybe, the dog had finally found what it had been searching for.